I can't really imagine a council like going to a rental-based valuation. Too costly, too difficult, too complex to understand in a residential context anyway. But before you can actually move, you have to have been on capital value for at least 3 years. We well and truly achieved that. So that was.
Excuse me, Nigel. An annual value, is that the potential rental income, or what is that exactly?
Rental income, exactly what it is.
Okay.
And as far as I know, the only councils that use it are capital cities. It's commonly used in capital cities because it's a relatively good measure of commercial property. I remember it well in my days as finance manager at Adelaide. A large amount of the valuation is actually based on what people actually pay. So there was a massive survey of every property every year, and they were required to advise what their rentals were, and that basically was the adoption of the value. Fine in the actual CBD, very difficult when you got to North Adelaide. Very complicated there because not a lot of rentals for a start, so residential context. Now I'm frozen. You might have to stay here. Frozen the musical. So the red light was working. I think I was going to stand up. That's why it was like that. So I can use this. I'll use that. Okay. So, and if you were to change the valuation base, you have to do a public consultation report and explain what the impact would be. Most importantly, also you cannot declare a rate unless you first adopted the valuation. That sort of makes common sense, I suppose. And the other interesting thing, which we spoke about a little bit last time, was that the Valuer General will do the values. They're doing them obviously for a whole range of different reasons. So that makes them fairly inexpensive. But you can do it yourself. Either engage valuers, which we used to do at Adelaide. I assume they probably still do. Or you could get, I suppose, the private sector to do it. The disadvantage will be the additional cost. You don't necessarily have to do the valuation every year, but there's some complexities in that. If you don't do it every year and there's big increases in between, you can imagine the problems that you get yourself into. So sort of the key questions that would normally apply, and I think some of these answer themselves, but the options that you have, the capital or annual. Yes, you've used capital for more than 3 years, probably for a long, long time. But probably more importantly, is capital value a reasonable measure of capacity to pay? I have opinion, but not always. Generally speaking, I suppose those that have studied this sort of thing have concluded that over a lifetime, it may be a reasonable measure of capacity to pay. But when you're younger or older, maybe not so. So that's the complexity that you face in setting rates. Is it a reasonable relative value base when you're comparing between properties? Again, not necessarily always the case. Especially when you're comparing neighbours and you're looking at fairness and equity.
Nigel, when you say not necessarily, what do you mean? What are the things that stop it from being reasonable?
Well, when we're talking about capacity to pay, as I said, at the younger age group, people probably have less money. that might have just invested in that new home over there at Roseworthy or Reeling or wherever, and they've consumed all their money. And if that property is there, therefore the value is going to be the basis of the rates, well, they don't necessarily have the capacity to pay on the value. If it was at the, I suppose the other end of the age scale, we're then in the realm of the generally asset rich and people have retired or on pensions and again don't have the income. So that's again not necessarily a good measure of their capacity to pay. On average, people in between, it may be good, and it may be on average over someone's lifetime, yes. But to rely entirely upon a valuation and a rate as a taxing base is where you have the complexity. I should highlight in the next workshop, we'll be having some experts from UniSA to come along to talk to us about measuring the ability to pay of ratepayers. So that will be.
What was that? I didn't hear that.
We're going to be having some experts from UniSA from their economic area are going to come and talk to us about a report they're writing for measuring the ability of ratepayers to pay. And they'll be using things like measures of income, taxable income of the region, and maybe comparing it to other council areas and looking at based on income levels. Well, what is the capacity of light ratepayers to pay? So we don't have the answer yet, but that might be interesting to see.
Nigel, does changing land use, would that be another application of that? Land use is changing within an area? Got vineyards coming into rural land or vegetable gardens in a rural area, that sort of thing, that change be some.
Yeah, that's certainly a factor, and I think as we spoke about last time too, tax deductibility has an element to it. If you make a profit, it's important. That's if you make a profit. Claim rates as a tax deduction. So that red part is basically just a conclusion of what I've already said about asset rich, low income. One of the other complexities, predominantly in primary production, but also in some commercial, is that there will be residents on site. So people actually live on their properties. So how do you differentiate what the actual land use is, and they're all under the Act as its predominant use. So there's another difficulty of using valuations.
I just, where you say there, including primary production, economic cycles, good years versus bad years, we can't really take that into account, can we? There's no way we can take that section into account. I don't think anyhow. Do you?
Well, I might have to disagree. And in poor years, and I suppose I've been in areas that have more poor years than what this area would have, and that's probably one of the interesting things. But you can exercise taxation restraint in difficult years. What would probably also happen in a commercial rental sense is that the valuation would immediately reflect the poor years. That doesn't necessarily happen in a capital valuation sense, so that's another difficulty.
In the case of the primary producer in 4 years, effectively that would be retrospective, because when we set the budget, we don't really know what the year's going to be like.
Correct.
So we actually, the year that they're actually paying their rates in might actually turn out to be a good year, but bad year was one before. So I suppose that means they haven't got that much money to start off with the year with.
But remember, Probably last time, one of the things we spoke about in terms of previous studies of this legislation, that is you have a lot of power. There are ways and means that you can deal with those issues. But if you go back to the principles, and if you go back to the complexities of dealing with it, you might decide that the cost of having 3 more accountants doesn't actually justify doing all that work. And the sort of things that obviously happen in other areas. So the Commonwealth taxation provides averaging in terms of income for certain parts of the primary production community. It's possible that we could probably do something like that with rates and rate rebates, but as I said, it might be very, very complicated and also difficult to explain. Remember one of those other principles, clarity, consistency, able to communicate it to the ratepayers, all pretty important. The mayor's trying to jump in.
Nigel, it's a tin of worms, isn't it, really? When you talk about the capacity to pay, it's okay for the options there for the rural rate, good years and bad years. But what about unemployment? Someone loses their job during the year. Isn't that the same as a good year or a bad year? So I don't know how you would be able to differentiate that in a capacity to pay. It's a bit like the capacity to pay for anything. Rates are just another part of the cost of being on this planet if you want to live in a particular place and own a property. I would like to think that the capacity to pay, everyone has some type of capacity to pay, but how you determine that as a consistent number, I would find that extremely difficult for a council chamber to be able to determine that on an individual basis. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it makes perfect sense. And I suppose without knowing the answer of what the UniSA people are going to tell you, I think they're going to be talking about the general in terms of the entire region as opposed to the specific related individual. So they might say to you that on average 2% of income in Light Regional Council gets paid in rates, and over there at Gawler they pay 3%. So therefore you can sort of position yourself in terms of that relativity, but that's certainly not dealing with individuals.
And you said before that with the good year and the bad year that there could be some restraint in taxation if there was a bad year, but it wouldn't then equally mean that if somebody has a good year, he should pay more? Because you never talk about this, like when we talk about, oh, these guys doing it tough and whatever, and then we lower the rates or whatever, but we never say, oh, he won the lottery or he had a really good year, let's up his rates. So why only go one way and not the other? Or, like, in my opinion, don't go anyway, but.
There's no right or wrong answers in these things. I suppose the area, and I'll go back to my experience at Adelaide where I saw this most, was that fixed rate in $1, annual rental values went down in the bad years, and therefore the rate revenue was less. You cut the budget to meet it. Not quite the same with capital values. They don't tend to go down. They tend to just get sticky and then launch off again another day.
Even in something like primary reduction, some categories of primary reduction in your council area might have bad year, others might have good year. The other thing is that I believe that there are hardship provisions in place so people can apply for if their circumstances change drastically in the way of the extended payment options and things of that kind that will pick up the really serious cases of capacity to pay, or incapacity to pay, I should say.
And you certainly applied that in the first COVID year, and you dealt with that in a rebate context. Briefly spoken about that already. Who should do the valuations? At the end of the day, the conclusion is probably going to be the value generals. So relatively cheap and independent. Doing it yourself brings brings a different complexity, and that is that you're also responsible for appeals. So if your own staff are doing the appeals, that can create a few difficulties. So what happens with council members, and I remember this well, is that the council members will be directly lobbied regarding valuations. And you'd probably rather not have that. Far better to say, go to the independent umpire and they will deal with this for you. I won't go through this in detail, but these are just the sorts of words that you'll use in terms of an actual policy in justifying why you would use capital value as a basis for your taxation policy. I should also say that I'll send out the presentation after the workshop, and these things you can study more at your leisure. Especially when I come to some of the benchmarking materials in a minute. That's probably something you want to sit down in a quiet time and think about the implications. Now, this is just words that need to go in the policy that says this is what our policy is. We're going to adopt, say, the State Valuation Office because they're the cheapest and they're independent. So that's pretty much that valuation section. Probably one of the more interesting parts of all this is the options that you have. You can impose general rates, separate rates, service charges. And the message regarding everything after general rates is that every one of those that you do, whether it be a separate rate, service rate or a charge, then reduces your reliance upon revenue from a capital value tax. So if you believe that, well, yeah, capital value is not really the best measure of capacity, ability to pay, then the more of the other sources of revenue they have, obviously you're reducing reliance on that capital valuation base. Fixed service charge can't be more than 50% of your general revenue, and that's different to minimum rates. Minimum rates can't be more than 35% of the ratepayers. Important, separate rates can be for a purpose that the council doesn't actually have to undertake. So you can have somebody else undertaking some form of development project and impose separate rates, and you don't actually carry out those works. Service charges and rates are for prescribed purposes, water, waste, television transmission. I have been at a council where we did television transmission. I don't know if we've ever done it here. Don't get into it. I promise you, do not do it. Sunday night when there's something wrong with the transmitter and everybody wants to watch the football or the movie, you're going to be called out to fix it. There are other possible things that the minister can declare, but I'm unaware of any others. The important thing about service charges is that they can only be used for the purpose for which you charge them. So you can't make a profit on them. So if you do have more money, it needs to be put aside in reserve, which is what you do with the common effluent, and then applied later. Now that, because the charge can include depreciation, which is not cash, that enables you to build up some money, which is what you've done, and do some replacement capital, etc. down the track.
I just have a question. You're saying that it can be amounts can be held in reserve. Are you talking paper reserve? Are you talking an account, or are you talking on paper?
I believe it should be on paper and held in cash. Now, how that's held in cash can be relatively flexible.
Well,
the reason why I believe it needs to be backed is because it can only be used for the purpose by which you raise it. So if you have a pool of cash flow and you use it for another purpose, arguably that's inconsistent with the Act.
See, through the chair, I've never understood paper. It's on paper and it's sitting in, and we're not using it, and it's. I don't understand. I've never understood that.
And to be honest, with the advance of finance and other complexities about borrowing, what you do to minimise your interest costs in pooling your cash reserves is sort of contrary to that notion of only being used for the purpose for which it's raised. But I think it's an area we just need to be fairly careful about. I prefer having the pool of cash, but having reports, and so that we can deal with it in the most efficient way of reducing our interest costs. But have reports that show where did that cash come from and what's it going to be used for in the future. So say replace the common effluent system. Differential rates may vary by use, locality, and use and locality. So a combination. So that your current basis of differential rates is by use. I would be surprised if an area like this in the past hasn't used locality. Those who've been around long might recall, but commonly in rural areas, locality was used as a differential rate for townships, and those outside of townships had a lower rate because of less service provision and the like. But the general preference these days is land use. Land use probably deals with that issue better than having a particular line on a map that says that's the town and everybody over that line gets a cheaper rate. That causes a few arguments where your next door neighbour still gets really the benefit of everything, but it's a lesser rate. So probably that's why it's gone out of fashion. And the odd one is that one land use category is non-use, which is vacant. That's specifically in the Act. And I spoke before about the multi-use complexity. Predominant use is the rule. So the main use of that land becomes the use. So they're the sort of options. The considerations that you normally have is, well, one general rate is simple, not having differentials. Meets the simplicity principle, lowest cost of administration. Differential rates have some additional costs to them, although with modern systems that can be relatively low. It does create a few challenges in the administration area. Taxing on locality has some pro-development benefits to it, and the sort of differentials you can have: residential, commercial, primary production, industrial, vacant, which you all know about because they're the ones you use. And mixed use has complexities, and something that I suppose has probably intrigued members over the last couple of years is the prospect of some form of capping or limitation, but of course that does increase the cost and complexity. I may have mentioned this before, but the eastern states got themselves in trouble with legislative capping some years ago because the valuations just kept increasing and the rates didn't ever catch up. So it just becomes a little bit of a quagmire. It's all right when you've got volatility to deal with, which is probably what we're experiencing now. But when it just keeps going on and on, particularly in certain parts of New South Wales, it all becomes a little bit more difficult. the way their legislation was written. Not quite so difficult with a rebating context. The software capacity. Well, they're probably all a lot of the theoretical stuff.
Nigel, back to that other slide. You say up there considerations, one general rate is simple, the question mark. Have you done any figures on that since the last workshop to work it out, how that could be accomplished?
But based on the new valuation, it wouldn't be much different to what I showed you last time. The one general rate would be pretty much exactly what your residential rate is now. It's about 0.45. And therefore, if it's 0.45, any of the other land use categories that are higher are compensating for the ones that are lower. But one general rate for light, not make any change whatsoever for any of your residential land use. They'd be paying exactly the same. It would only be the industrials would come down and the primary production would go up, etc. But as I said, it's a fairly simple process.
Okay. Yeah.
I like to hope you think that this is some of the more interesting things, and maybe this has been done here before. But this is what I'm calling some rough benchmarks. Benchmarks being a fancy word for comparing with somebody else. And what I threw into the benchmark mix was your neighbouring councils, but also threw in ones that I think have similar characteristics. Relative close proximity to Adelaide, so valuation demand is all increasing there, or demand is increasing, valuation, I should say. To varying degrees, mix of agriculture and culture, different types, experiencing relative rapid growth, have got varying degrees of tourism involved in these areas. Some of them I know more about than others, but I thought this would be a useful place to start to position yourself so that you understand, well, where do you fit in the scheme of things? And I know there's lots of numbers on this, and I think that this is probably when you get the presentation you take and study it at home. But I'll just run through the process that I adopted. And the process adopted was that, so I've got columns for each council, and it goes over 2 slides. And in both slides, I've got light on the left-hand side. One of the things I did was to say, well, let's calculate what the current average residential valuation is now and what the current primary production valuation is. So I'm trying to keep it simple. Those categories represent 90% of your ratepayers. A lot of the others are fairly individualistic, so we need to understand what the impact would be there as well. I then collected what the valuation was. Well, they're all on capital, unsurprisingly. I've then indicated whether they're using the minimum rate or the fixed charge. Because you have to understand that, because it has a huge impact on the actual rate in the dollar that they then use, depending on how much they're getting from the fixed charge. I've then listed all of the differential rates for each of these councils, and I've calculated what each differential rate is as a percentage of the residential. So if we take primary production, for example, in light, it's 75% of your residential rate, and your vacant land is 175%. And the reason I did that was to enable you to compare that across these other areas. I don't know that I mentioned, I've also included fixed charge and you've got more councils in this comparison mix that have moved to the fixed charge now. I'll come back to that a bit more. What I've also done is calculated what the average residential rates are and what the average primary production rates are. And I'm doing that to enable you to compare that with others. Now, this is the next step regarding the average rates. Again, I suppose there can be an argument against it. And what I've done is said that if you had $356,000 invested in the house and you took your $356,000 and bought a house in one of these other council areas, I've calculated the rates that you would pay on that $356,000. Now, there'll be those that will argue you can't do that because a $356,000 house in this particular town will be valued more or less in a town in another area. But that's partly valid. I'm more interested in what's the tax that you're paying on your capital investment of $356,000. I think that's reasonably valid. And similarly on the primary production average of $840,000, what's the ratepayer tax you're paying in terms of average rates? So I won't go through them all tonight, but probably some interesting ones. I suppose you'd be particularly interested in Barossa on what's going on there. So radically different. So the rate and the dollars aren't going to be useful for you to compare. So you have got a fixed charge of $380. I haven't found the principle behind how they got to $380. It's obviously not the maximum. And then you've got their rate in the dollars. So they seem to be all over the place in terms of the percentages, but primary production, 92%. Interesting number. The other thing when you get to have a good look at this is that sometimes it's more and sometimes it's less. So the science behind how those councils establish relativities of the differentials is not particularly obvious. And I suspect that history has got more to do with it than anything else.
Nigel, did you find out how Adelaide Hills came up with a fixed charge of a minimum of $699?
Well, Adelaide Hills is a fixed charge of $699.
Yeah.
It looks like when you go shopping for a television. To me. They really wanted 700, but $699 sounded cheaper. It's not 50%. So there really needs to be in the rating policy the reason why you've gone to that. And
So your residential in the Adelaide Hills is 0.2453. Then the rest of them are all the 0.2, nearly all 0.2s. Is that because of the fixed charge?
they're all 0.2 because it's a fixed charge. So it looks like that probably about 40% of their revenue is coming from the fixed charge. So that I'll flip to the next one where the other extreme is, and that's obviously not the same sorts of area as here, but that's our friends here at Playford. They've gone to the absolute maximum, right to the last cent, $1,018.29. To me, that breaks the principle of simplicity, cheapness. God, I wouldn't like to explain that to a ratepayer, how you arrived at that, but that they have some phenomenal rates in the dollar, massive from the commercial industrial sectors. So partly the reason for that is that the fixed charge is becomes a relatively small component of, say, a large commercial or industrial thing. But I'm not sure how you'd write a policy to justify that differential. Um, what is probably interesting in terms of your positioning, if you focus on the far right here, so the average residential rate on that calculation, 1693, so you're 1595. So you're towards the lower range of all of these benchmarks of similar sorts of councils. This is a calculation. If you take the Grants Commission information, they also calculate the residential rate, not based on evaluation, but just taking the number of properties and dividing it by your residential rates. And they also publish, and you're still at the lower end of the range. So I might leave you to study that and think about those comparisons, and maybe we could have some more discussion at the next workshop. Just the graphic representation of it. So you're in the middle. You're the West Coast Eagles, the dark blue and the gold. So the dark blue represents the residential rate comparison, and that gold compared to the brownish red ones represents what your primary production is level on average. So you can see that it's certainly not the most expensive rate council, and not necessarily the cheapest on either as well. So Mount Barker seems to be a little bit on the cheaper side for residential, but higher on the commercial. It's certainly, there's something there about consistency of rating policies or inconsistency of rating policies. And I suppose the ammunition it gives you with ratepayers is you, when they say to you, "Oh, you're the most expensive," you're not.
Nigel, when would you expect us to set the rate? When?
For the next budget or under this policy?
So after we've had the next workshop, then we'll set it.
Next year, not this year.
That's 22-23. Yeah.
I expect you've done the 22-23 budget by the time we do the next workshop. Next workshop's tentatively scheduled for the first week of August. By law, you won't be able to do anything for the next cycle. The UniSA people are writing their paper, and they expect to have it finished by the end of July after they've done their research. That's not to say that this doesn't give you information about where you sit. Scheme of things.
Effectively, that for this coming budget, we use the current rating policy or a variation thereof, similar to what we did in the last one, where we did a minor tweak to the rate in the dollar for rural to take into account the fact that their valuation increased dramatically. So basically, what we're talking about here is the major review and development of a rating policy that will go probably approved by the next council.
Correct.
So we're doing the spade work now, but the discussion that we're having now can perhaps guide us to some extent in any tweaking we might do in the budget numbers. Is that what you're suggesting?
That's what I'm suggesting, and just having an awareness of where you sit in the league ladder enables you at least to feel some comfort with your current rating levels. I've been writing the report for the Audit Risk Committee next week, which is the introduction to the budget process. And I admit I have got a page in there. It hasn't been approved by anybody at this stage, but there's a page in there that talks about the potential for the tweaking of the policy regarding providing rebates for extraordinary changes in property valuation. And the only reason I put it in this year, which is a little bit advance of, well, let's not change the policy now, is because of that very large increase in residential values that's popped up. So the average in the three bigger towns is 13-14%, and there will be properties in those groups, apart from the 13-40% that will be higher as well. So the Act says that the council is required to take that into consideration when it does its policy. So saying that we'll leave it until the following year may not actually make the requirements of the Act. So this was just a summary. So as I said, this was out of the Grants Commission 2021. We don't have the 21-22 data yet, so it pretty much backs up the rank. So the lowest is Clare and Gilbert Valley. And this is only residential, and they probably make up for it somewhere else. Hardly any difference between Light and Barossa, and yeah, some of the others are a little bit more expensive, especially that Adelaide Hills currently loses that one. So this just documents a lot of what I've already said, sorts of things that would go in a rating policy. I think we've been doing the questions, so I'll keep skipping on, mindful of the time. And this brings us to the minimum rate. I think we've probably discussed a lot of this, and you're well aware of it. Can't be on less than a single allotment, although the definition of allotment can be quite broad. You can only have 35% of properties on the minimum rate. There used to be some large metropolitan councils that are quite delinquent in this regard. One of those is a neighbour that used to have some phenomenal percentage on the minimum rate. I think they were over 60% at some point, and I think they're the ones that caused the Act to get changed.
Nigel, just going back to that previous slide with the residential rate, do you have any table for the primary production and the overall rate where we sit in the rankings?
The only one I've got is the one that I've generated in terms of those comparison slides for primary production. The Grants Commission doesn't collect it. They've only ever collected residential rate. I suspect it's because primary production is all over the place, across the state. So it's very difficult. Plus, probably of somewhat less interest to the metro.
I just wouldn't like to be saying to people that their rates are cheaper here and not more expensive here, or they're as good if we don't know.
So that's what this chart represented. So your primary production average is the gold for your average $840,000 value. So there are some that are cheaper, but Clare and Gilbert Valley would be cheaper. There's a few pretty much around what you are. Adelaide Hills, I assume they probably have less of primary production than you, but then there's others that are more expensive. Adelaide Plains, on average, for that value property.
That's why I was looking for
expensive.
a total average of the whole lot. So you can say that's our average rate.
So that's what that right-hand column is 3,246. This number here.
Yeah.
That's 840,000 of investment in all of these properties on average. So you're 2822. Victor 3370, around the average, but there you're considerably lower than that. Oops.
By that, we look like we're the lowest.
Adelaide Hills, very similar to
Oh,
you.
sorry.
Adelaide Plains, a lot more expensive. Rossa more expensive.
Third. And that takes into account all the categories, rates, differential categories
Well, this is just primary production and residential.
and residential.
Rest are just,
And we can't factor in the commercial.
I could do something similar, but I suspect that it's, you know, all sorts of different businesses and
No, I'm just conscious of of what we say to people, you know, when we talk about rates. They tell us that we're too expensive, we're more expensive than somewhere else, and we have to try and defend that somehow. And I only like to defend things with facts. And that's not telling me the full story.
I will do the best I can to summarise it for you.
That's all we need, just something to go on. But, we can answer the question, you know, truthfully.
So, computer complexity, contiguous land and boundary complexities, single farm enterprises, more computer complexity and cost, something we regularly have to verify. Single farm enterprise can be allotments that aren't adjoined, so you can have a business with multiple different locations but still be one farm enterprise. The fixed charge can't be more than 50%. Can't be more than can't be imposed on anything less than an allotment. Same as numerous.
Single
Contiguous
farm
land,
enterprise,
it's exactly the same.
that was,
So the key considerations, why would you select a particular level of minimum rate or fixed charge? And one concept is that it's a contribution to the minimum costs of services consumption. Sounds great in principle, but how do you actually calculate that? You could probably go through a rigorous accounting exercise of working out some numbers, but I suspect that it's more in principle than in detail. One thing which I always like you to look at is what I call the minimum rate premium. So when you apply a minimum rate, how much additional revenue are you actually receiving from the minimum rate? In other words, is the exercise actually worth it? So last year you didn't increase your minimum rate. So the number of properties is substantially less this year on the minimum than the previous year. But even apart from the number of properties, it's close to half. Even apart from the number of properties, if the additional premium that you're getting from a minimum rate is $5 or $10, would you really want to be bothered with that signal and telling people you're on the minimum rate? Because they see that as being, oh, well, I'm being charged extra. But in terms of where you're at on your minimum rate at the moment, it's not particularly high, and I have those numbers in a minute. It doesn't necessarily address capacity to pay or the service benefit, because especially in your area, it's very close to the capital valuation rate and the dollar calculation anyway. If it was significantly higher, then we'd have a different argument. Both the service charge and general rate seems to address a bit of a balance between capacity to pay, service benefit, capital valuation being a tax, and that there's papers being written that say that fixed charge has more logic to it than the minimum rate context. And I think I said at the last workshop that I recall when minimum rate was basically an admin fee. You made sure you covered the cost of the accounting, and somewhere over the decades it became something else. And we've already spoken about this, that distribution of valuation. So you're having some understanding of where the main ratepayer base actually exists. So this is the current year. So there's 8,150 assessments spread across those land use categories. And as you can see, the vast majority of your ratepayers are residential and primary production, but vacant land is growing significantly. So number of properties on the minimum rate, 696, and that's the premium that you receive, $126,000 in the scheme of your budget. It's a relatively small contribution, averaging 182, but it's just worthy of discussion as to whether that's the better approach for the future. Moving to a fixed charge, as the numbers that I spoke about last time show, would be a radical change. So it's not something you'd want to go into lightly.
Nigel, what would be the value of the residential property minimum rate? Is it 200,000 or 250? What would the, for it to be?
What would, it's 196 something thousand.
So residential rate would have to be less than 196,000 to incur a minimum rate.
Correct. And there's also quite a lot of property between 196,000 and 220,000 not paying a minimum rate. I suppose I'd be used to a policy in terms of that the consistency principle, that you'd have a minimum set at some level, but it naturally keeps its equilibrium and increases rather than having significant change, which is actually contrary to your existing policy document having significant change. The question I would ask is how high does it have to go to actually encourage people to do that? I suspect these days, and I don't know the detail of what's happening in places like the Roseworthy developments now, but I'd be surprised if they don't have encumbrances that say you've got to build within. So that would be far stronger a mechanism than the rate. And to keep under the 35% threshold, you're not going to go to too high an amount. If it was $1,500, would that actually force somebody to go and put a house on the block that they would like to actually keep as an investment? I suspect not, unless the encumbrance stops them.
Nigel, so if the minimum rate goes, this question's always been asked by ratepayers, why do we have to pay that? And we're paying for the services that go past our block. And does a proportion of the minimum rate go into the funds that are for putting the CWMS things through and services? Does that go? You don't. It just stays. It's just
General rate revenue goes towards everything.
All right, okay.
Just a quick one, Nigel. I'm just a bit curious of commercial shops, 68. I thought we'd have far more than 68 shops in our regional council area. Doesn't seem like a big number at all.
Sorry, I haven't personally gone out and visited them or anything, but this is what comes out of our current rating database.
Yeah, it just seems extraordinarily low number.
It would be interesting to know what's in commercial other. There's quite a few there. There could be combination things that are predominant commercial other used when they're actually got a shop front as well. That would be a guess. This is just the formal way that you'd either adopt a policy or minimum rate, the sort of things you'd say and what you'd do for a service charge. And I just highlight there that it's to be a uniform fixed charge. It's only one and it applies to everybody and maximum 50%. But I am skipping ahead because I was hoping to get to this part, just so that you're thinking about it. The key message regarding the legislation is that you effectively have two ways of reducing the burden of significant property valuation increases. One is a cap in terms of the legislation that says that effectively you can do whatever you like in terms of the way you would manage the rate in terms of trying to limit what that impact might be. But the difference with that part of the legislation is that it only applies to residential and it only applies to effectively own or occupy residents. So there's a complexity about that. What the rebate does though is it probably more powerful part is that it applies to everybody or can apply to everybody. And the legislation has probably come in play after the capping type approach was tried. It probably came in and made it very broad. So, and the difference with a rebate is relatively insignificant. You can change the rate in a dollar, or you can apply a rebate. The rebate approach probably gives you far broader policy choice under the Act. So that the first one is that, as I said, only applies to residential ratepayers. You set a maximum increase. And with the rebate is couched in terms of relief for a substantial change in rates, and there's various categories of this, but the one you'd be most interested in now is large increases in property value. It applies to all, or can apply to all ratepayers, but that's your choice. As I said, it changes the underlying rating basis structure. It doesn't change the method. One of the, I suppose, relatively vague reasons for applying rebates is the proper development of the area. That's not really suitable for the large increases for in property valuations or reducing the burden of that. You can do capping in terms of rebates where you're trying to support particular businesses. Rebates can be by application. Don't have to be by application. You can apply it automatically on a rate notice. But there are some advantages of application, and that is you can have some other criteria that you don't necessarily know about in the application. Some of them can be automatic. For instance, you might have a rule that said that if, and this applies in other council areas, by the way, if the property sold last year, you wouldn't be entitled to a rebate because of a property valuation increase. Because it's a bit hard to argue that your rates are going up if you didn't actually pay them the previous year. I think that's the concept. That sort of thing can be applicable in an application process. But if you go back to the principles, as soon as you do an application to the process, the admin goes up, complexities go up. And these, I won't go through the detail, but these are the sorts of words that you could use in a rate capping situation and how you might apply it. In here, I've put a few different criteria that might be considered. So first of all, you'd say, well, what would be the maximum increase that you want to try and cap at? And one logical approach would say, well, the average increase is 10% across the region. Well, let's cap it at that. So anyone who's got extreme values well above the 10% would benefit by say, a rebate. But the sorts of rules that you would also bring about might be, this is the complexity, that if you had a major extension in your house or an upgrade, and we know about those things, obviously, you might not get a rebate because the reason your rates went up is because you've just built on substantially or renovated the house. There's a beautiful house just around the corner here, for example, that's just been done up. I bet you their rates are going up this year because it looks very nice. They should have left the front because now the valuer knows. Another criteria that others use, other than the change in ownership, is a change in land use. So it's actually gone from one to the other. That makes it complex. And another one to consider would be whether you had a minimum level of rebate. Now that's very difficult if you mess with the rate and the dollar, but the rebate, we could simply say, look, it's not worth our while doing less than $50 or $40. If we didn't have a minimum, it'd mean we'd be doing rebates for $1.50 because someone was just a little bit over. And I don't think that's probably what you're trying to achieve. That's pretty much the sorts of conditions that apply. I might leave this for you to read the presentation because I'm mindful of the time. Here's the breaking of the principles. We've got all these sorts of rules regarding rate rebates, which we would have to administer. And that pretty much brings me to the end of tonight. Sort of open to you if you got any other questions. I didn't want to keep you here too late because we sort of lingered on a bit last time.
Yeah, I got a question. We always talk about, when you're talking about rate capping and that, so that it seems like the problem is the increase in the property valuation, and then therefore the rates go up significantly, and this is a problem. But why are we talking about this as a problem? Because in essence, like rates are in essence a wealth tax to a certain degree. So if somebody gets, this is a progressive sort of tax system. So if somebody gets more wealthy, he needs to pay more tax. So why is that an issue? Why don't we just say, look, somebody got more wealthy and that's a good thing for them, so they pay a little bit more tax? Because all the time I hear people saying, oh, look, council put this beautiful road in front of my house and yay, my value went up. I'm happy about this. Or they put a playground in or a tennis court or whatever they do. And people are stoked about that fact that their house is now more valuable because now they can go borrow more, they can do whatever they want to do. So therefore, what is the issue with somebody getting richer and then having to pay more tax? I mean, it seems to be a totally fair thing.
I suspect that's probably more of a discussion with the council rather than an actual question. That's probably more a point of view. But a couple of things though that probably come to mind is that fairly fundamental with, or even your policy wording as it stands now, is that you try to avoid significant volatility in your rating. It's generally what people feel uncomfortable with, I suppose. That's probably the main thing that you're trying to avoid. You know, experiencing, say, a 15-16% increase in your rates this year may make you fairly unhappy with your local council.
Simon, I think you've touched on something that's very interesting in a social aspect, because people are going to tell us shortly that they're pretty happy that their value of their land has gone up. But the moment we put the rates up, we're going to get told a different matter. And that's a human nature problem, something that I think we've got little or no control over. That's the problem. It's the way people think about things in a sense that they want the value of their land to go up, but they don't want to pay the consequence of that. And I don't know how we resolve that. I don't think we can.
I'm just going to say, contrary to that, so I've sold a property for a lady, lived in the same house for 40 years. Her husband passed away, so now she's back onto one single income. But so what she's saying is, if the rates keep on increasing, she will not be able to live in the house that she lived for 40 years. So then she's got to leave her community with all her friends and maybe go to another area to live. So her whole life's destroyed because of capacity to pay. So I don't know how do you balance that out? I don't know.
I got a good friend in Rosehill that's exactly the same thing, who lives on a single pension, but she owns her house outright. That house is worth $500,000. So how is she just go out and borrow $200,000? She's 80 years old. That'll see her out till she dies in that house. Like, I mean, but she would never do that, obviously. So she'd cry like, "Oh, I can't pay." Like, well, you could just go borrow some money on your house and you outright own. I mean, I don't know how the situation with you ladies, but I mean, people just, I don't know, they're always like, "Oh, tax goes up," oh, but they're happy owning stuff and having stuff, but they just never want to pay. That's just, I don't like that. If my value of my house goes up, I'll gladly pay more tax. That's just how it is.
So Nigel, your rate capping really is valuation capping rather than rate capping. You're suggesting that someone's valuation goes up by 15%. We allow them to 10%. So it's actually a capping of the valuation for that year.
The valuation increase.
So it's not not really rate capping as the government was trying to force onto us the previous time.
That partly I suppose the bureaucratic answer to this I mentioned before is that the Local Government Act says now that you are compelled to consider it. So we're considering it. Whether you do it, you've complied with the Act by considering it and talking about the factors that apply. I suppose the other bureaucratic answer is that, and I should get you the statistics on this, it is increasingly being done by other councils. That doesn't mean it's right, but the more that do it, the more you'll come under pressure to do the same, because people will come from somewhere else and move here. And well, we used to have that at Mount Barker, so why don't you do it?
Thanks very much, Nigel, for an excellent workshop. Once again, it was interesting that we probably started with a can of worms talking about the capacity to pay, and I think we ended up with a can of worms too, of who actually has to pay. But I think you're taking us down a pathway that is something for the future, and we've really got to look at it. we've got to understand it. And I know I'm not the sharpest pencil in the case, and I struggle sometimes with some of this. But I think as we go through the workshop, we'll wait till the end of it, and we might have a lot of questions then. Questions on the way through are good, of course, but till you get a proper understanding of where we're going, it's hard to know what the questions you need to ask are. But I think we've probably, us here tonight anyway, have probably learned more about rating options and policy, future policy, than we knew. And now it's opened up a whole new way of thinking. So I look forward to the next workshop with the university input. I think that will be very interesting indeed. And I think what we've got to look at as a council, and we do, what's best for our residents? We're residents, we're ratepayers. What's best for us? You know, how do we make this work for the future? And at least we're doing something about it. We're probably one, as Brian said earlier, probably one of the few councils in the state that will have a rating policy, a proper rating policy, so we can understand it. We can massage that if we need to into the future. We won't get it perfect the first time, I'm sure, but we'll get something a lot better than we've got now, where we seem to be a little bit all over the place. So I really thank you for bringing it to our attention and presenting it in the way you have. It's been terrific. Thank you. Thanks, councillors. And I can officially close it. Well, there's a recommendation down the bottom of the report, that the reports for information be, sorry? I'll move by Lynette and then seconded by Councillor Dean. All those in favour that the reports for information be received, and it's been carried. Thank you.